All right, so as everybody finishes trickling in, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Better Cities Project's Executive Director, Greg Brooks, and Greg will introduce our two panelists and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you to everybody who's coming in right now. We've been really gratified by the response to this because it reflects not just the innovation of what Mayor Levesque has done in Auburn, but also the urgency that we see in communities all over the country that are struggling with how to make housing more abundant and more affordable in their community. I have often said that the road to resilient and robust housing in communities has a lot of paths. This case study that we'll be talking about today is a good example of something that would work in many towns, and I would dare say that there are pieces of it that could work in virtually any town. But I'm very big on ideation growing out of these webinars, and I'd encourage all of you, jot down notes, have questions. We don't want this to just be speaking to you in a one-way manner, and we're going to leave a lot of time for Q&A. My colleague, Patrick Toohey, is Director of Policy for Better Cities Project. He's just joining us right now. He had a slight delay. And there's Patrick. Patrick, I have welcomed the crowd. Why don't you pick it up at letting them know a bit about Better Cities Project and introducing Jason and Salim. And if you have connectivity
Certainly.
issues, I'll pick it back
Thank you,
up.
everyone, and I apologize. How am I doing? Can you hear me?
You're coming in and out.
You know what? In the interest of keeping things moving along, I'll do the introductions. For those of you who don't know much about Better Cities Project, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy organization. We are fairly unique in that we are wholly focused on practical solutions for local government, and we work with local governments across the country, providing research recommendations, policy model ordinances where appropriate. We are not consultants. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to suggest things that work elsewhere that might work in your community. I'm joined on the call today by Mayor Jason Levesque of the city of Auburn, Maine. The mayor came to local government after a long career in the private sector and set his sights on housing reform fairly early in his tenure as part of a larger revitalization agenda. He is joined by Salim Firth from the Mercatus Center, who is a senior researcher there and heads up their urbanity project. And let me start, Mayor Levesque, by asking you to give us a little bit of background on what strikes me as the two paths that weave back and forth in your city's tale of housing and zoning reform. It strikes me that there's both a policy and a political aspect to this story. Walk us through the basics.
Oh, the basics. We could be here for hours, but yes, policy and politics are intertwined. Obviously, when any elected official or any time an elected official introduces new policy, there is a political undertone or an overtone. And in Auburn, it was definitely an overtone. Everybody likes progress, but very few people like change. And that really came to light. And I had no idea that was going to happen, by the way. I really thought this was good policy, zoning reform, adding more people, building an economically sustainable city for generations to come by focusing on foundational principles. That was highly controversial, and it still is today. So those are the two paths. We have to kind of keep pushing forth policy, changing and being very dynamic. Really, when you meet opposition, when you meet challenges, how do you move? How do you plan those moves before they actually need to happen? And then on the politics side, how do you continue to get your message across? How do you continue to frame your message about the benefits of the policy while acknowledging that there are some potential downsides, if you would, or challenges to implementation. So it really is, and that's a great way, Greg, to look at it, 2 pathways forward. They all happen as close to simultaneously as possible, but it's never perfect.
Jason, thanks for that. Salim, you come at this from the point of view of a researcher and somebody who's really immersed in finding out what's working nationwide. What did you see when you looked at Auburn?
So I think Auburn was really unique in a bunch of dimensions. And I guess I'll say up front, it's then don't take offense, Mayor, but like, it's not that unique as a city, right? Like it's pretty much an American every town. It could be, in Maine, it could be in Texas, it could be in California. It's a place with pretty average incomes, reasonably typical demographic mix for its state, and people at different stages of life. So what you expect in an American town. That said, I think there's some, maybe it's the length of time that Auburn hasn't grown and the general sense that the state of Maine is declining. My mom's from Maine. She goes home and she's like, everyone here is getting older and there aren't that many young kids. And so I think there's generally a desire in Maine to see growth, which is what would be really unique relative to, say a town in Maryland where I live now might say, oh my gosh, we've had so much growth, we don't want any more. And so they really started from a place of saying, well, we want to grow. We want more families to stay in Maine instead of moving away. And how, what are the policies that we're going to pursue to make that happen? And so there's a real positivity and bipartisanship and sort of people coming from a lot of different backgrounds and saying, okay, we want this goal. Now let's maybe argue a little bit about how to achieve it. But it was, kind of a very nice debate to have.
And I always like to assume that everybody's done their homework, but just let's assume that some people on the call haven't read the case study. Salim, give me the 2 or 3 sentences on what the problem was that was targeted and how the city addressed it.
So first of all, shout out to my co-author, Eric Cousins. He's on the call here. He's the planning director for Auburn. And did a lot of, especially the kind of the background work. He did the work, but then in terms of the writing the case study, he did the background work and really filling in a lot of that research part. And I think I did more of the writing. But yeah, what we looked at was, okay, so the city wants to grow. And in a lot of other eras, times and places, a new pro-growth mayor, Mayor Levesque got elected in 2017, is that right? And,
yeah.
And a new pro-growth mayor would sort of focus on, well, can I spend some money and attract a big business, get the Walmart, something like that. And maybe after a year of finding his feet, Mayor Levesque first sort of focused on, all right, we've got a huge agricultural and resource zone, which is mostly just low-value forest land. Could we fit more homes there? And that turned out to be divisive. A lot of, there were people who said yes, there were people who said no. But he turned the people who said no into allies and said, well, okay, so you guys don't want to build a lot more homes in the ag zone. Well, then what about infill development where we already have sewer and water and in our walkable kind of typical suburban core? And it turned out that a lot of people said yes to that. So the problem wasn't particularly strict zoning. Auburn was not an especially tightly zoned city up front, but it was just that the reality is you can't find that many sites where you can build multifamily housing, and there aren't that many places in Auburn left where you can do a sizable subdivision, especially not one that's walkable. And it's got a great walkable core, but really you had to renovate an old house to be able to create a new product there. And the new zoning is going to allow a lot more growth within those infill sites in the walkable core, which is where the consensus was that that's actually where we want growth, where it's going to make the city stronger, support local businesses. So I think there were really 2 key components there that I'll just repeat here. So one is a mayor who said, it isn't just that I want to go find jobs, I want to find houses. The people are my fundamental asset. And I think that's new thinking, and I think that's correct. And then the second was finding that political consensus around, we can agree that growth is needed in this walkable core. There's still debate about how much and how to do growth in less urban part of the city.
So, Mayor Levesque, that's, at the risk of having you believe your own PR, that sounds almost like a Cinderella story of housing reform, right? I'm sure you encountered problems along the way. And in fact, one of the things I found most interesting in the case study, because I was involved in community involvement for many years, is this dichotomy between a loud minority of people who showed up at the times and places you expected them to show up to dispute your plans, and the larger majority of people who were essentially silently supporting. And so, first of all, talk me through whether you've achieved what you want to achieve. But as part of that, tell me how you guys figured out the metrics to separate the wheat from the chaff on public opinion.
Well, first of all, let me state the whole process might have gone a lot smoother if one of two things happened. I actually had a knowledge or knew that the Better City Project, for example, was around. I didn't really know how to define what I wanted to do, how to get that, how to verbalize that, not just to the public, but to staff. So there's a lot of tripping along the way. It was not a perfect or beautiful, if you would, process. Huge teachable moments throughout. But with that aside, gotten a lot of help since then. It kind of really defined what we're doing, get our feet, underneath us, so to speak. But to your second part, the wheat and the chaff, it became clear over the last 18 months or so that out of a city of 25,000 people, we were getting the same 10 people, the same 15 people, more or less, showing up at each planning board meeting, at each city council meeting. Now, you try to engage those individuals, bring them in, understand what their concerns are, and try to address those concerns. But when their solution to compromise is no change whatsoever, that was a fundamental problem. Okay, so that actually hurt the entire process to a point. It still is hurting the process, but we understood that's the chaff. The regular people who, when you sat down and discussed with them how zone changes were going to make your community stronger, better, more opportunities, a nicer place to live, and more amenities, they were actually extremely supportive. And I use the sausage analogy a lot. Nobody likes how the sausage is made, but by God, it's good. Nobody liked the fact that they were scared about, Auburn's getting rid of all the commercial parking requirements. And people were very upset about that. But then we did. And the very next day, Olive Garden said, because of this, we are now going to open up a new Olive Garden in Auburn. Now, Olive Garden has been on the residents' wish list for 20 years. It may seem like a small thing, but when you're in Maine, you don't have to drive 30 miles for soup and salad. It's a big deal. So everybody loves the sausage. They just didn't like how it was made. And now we're past that. We have more retail opportunities, more housing opportunities. We're seeing this growth because of those incremental changes that Auburn's done. And we're not nearly done yet. We're still moving forward at a very, I'd say, smart but expedited fashion.
Okay, so question for both of you. Tell me the top 2 or 3 things, and it's okay to get into the weeds a little bit about this, but I want people to understand the specifics of what was changed.
So I'll talk about one of them. And Mayor Levesque just mentioned removing commercial parking, which is great. So I would say the biggest one, and the one that I was most impressed and surprised that a city would be willing to lead on, was allowing kind of what I would call all of the above residential zoning. Right. So you could call it just multifamily zoning. So we're going to allow multifamily housing everywhere in the city that's got sewer and water. They're rolling it out in stages. That's essentially the vision. But what we see from, like, say, Houston, Texas, which has never had zoning and allows multifamily zoning everywhere, is that it doesn't fill up with multifamily. There's lots and lots of single family houses, townhouses, et cetera, in Houston. And that's what I expect in Auburn. So I think we need a new name for it. Can't call it multifamily zoning because it's not going to be 90% multifamily the way that a multifamily zone in Boston or Minneapolis is. It's going to be mixed. And I really like this was absolutely Eric Cousins and Jason's idea. They started with the real world. There's a place called Grace Lawn Apartments, you can Google it, that was built was permitted a few years before the reform in a traditional multifamily zone. And they said, okay, what made the economics work at Graceland? And it was 3 full stories of height, and a certain amount of coverage. They went easy on the parking requirements. They said 1 parking space per unit, so there's not a lot of parking requirement. You can build more than that if you need it. And they basically wrote regulations based on a real world example. So if you know what works here, we're going to allow you to build something roughly like Graceland everywhere. There's technically no density limit in the new zone. So if you wanted to build really small units and have no parking spaces, you could actually do that. You might have trouble marketing them because there's not that many jobs in any one walkable location in Auburn. So, I don't think any developers actually even jump on that. But maybe if you've got a small parcel that, isn't big enough for, a traditional 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 square foot lot, maybe you've got a sliver of parcel, you put a tiny home on them. I saw a couple of those when I was in Maine last, over near Bowdoin. And, I think that's what's really impressive, is allowing this kind of any kind of housing up to a 3-story height limit with reasonable setbacks anywhere in the sewer part of the city. And that's just revolutionary. And, we got cities like Minneapolis talking about, ending single family zoning by allowing duplexes and triplexes. Like, yeah, that's a good first step, but like Auburn is the real, this is what I would like the real big cities of Boston to do, right? Could Boston allow 3-story apartment buildings everywhere? Like right now, Boston's like, whoa, we need discretionary review if it's going over 15 units. But if apartment buildings can just be by right in Auburn, they can be by right in Boston.
It's I like that vision. I can hear the pushback, but I like to. Mayor Levesque, what are you most proud of in terms of the specifics?
Overarching theme here is to take government control out of the mix and put that control and empower residents. So how do you do that? Little incremental changes. For example, a building fee, traditional building fee in Maine to build a house, single family home or duplex, $1,500 to $2,500 space. Add on a couple $1,000s in impact fees if your community has those, and a lot do, especially in Southern Maine. In Auburn, we got rid of it. It's $25 to permit a home. There's no impact fee. Okay, if you want to build a home, great. Come here, build a home. Okay, it's your home, it's your land. Please fit in, because we know, based upon lessons in our own history and in other communities' histories, before zoning, people will start building homes that fit the aesthetic of the homes around them. 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit buildings, 2-story, 2.5, and so forth. And what we're doing is, it might be, as Dr. Firth says, kind of revolutionary, but really it's going back to basics. It's looking at Auburn really segregationist and exclusionary zoning practices pre-1950s, and looking at our best neighborhoods, all of which were primarily built before 1950, and saying, this is what we want to preserve, and this is what we want to replicate. And all those great neighborhoods are a mix of different housing types and different housing styles. So allowing the people to have that authority, the individual to have that power to do the right thing, and trust them that they will do the right thing, I think is really kind of what we're trying to do here in Auburn. So now we're talking about ADUs. We're talking about in-law apartments above garages, expanding out of houses for an additional bedroom and a bath, so an in-law or a family member can move in. I mean, we've got dozens of these stories. It just really, it's hard to say specifically what we've done, because I'm pretty proud of everything we've done and everything we want to do. But the underlying, if you would, condition is taking the power away from government and using government as a guide and a motivating factor, but allowing the individuals to do what built the city to its greatness earlier, before our zoning made it stagnant. And our population, to give you one example, was around 24,000 in 1960. It's just now in the last 2 years where it's seen that rise from 24 to 25, maybe even 26. It's kind of hard to keep track of that over the last 18 months. So, and that's all about putting the power back into the people's hands.
So what would you say to your elected colleagues, some of whom are on the call. We have a mix of people interested in housing policy, people working at the staff level, and people who are elected officials in the audience. Particularly in larger cities, but I've seen this in smaller towns as well. The ability to say yes or no to a project, or to extract additional revenue from a project, or pursue an agenda through things like inclusionary zoning. What do you say to your elected colleagues who believe that that's an important source of not just their power? That's a sort of a gross political way to look at it, but it's part of their job as an elected official, is that sort of discretionary aspect. What's the counterpoint to that?
Tear away all the crud on top of the issues and the bureaucracy, and look at actually why we're elected. We're elected in order to represent the people, in order for the people to have the ability to gain economic wealth, generational wealth, eliminate generational poverty, in order to build something for the future for themselves and their community. Recognize that. Let's not be short-sighted. Let's not use government power, either implied or actually prescribed government authority, in order to try to create something in your mind that is utopia, if you would, and over-plan a situation. It's really about not being so short-sighted and actually letting things holistically and organically grow within reason. Broad parameters are fine. I mean, we've adopted form-based code. We pretty much say, here's your box. Build within your box. And that's a good thing. We don't need to approve everything. That's, in my mind, is fundamentally wrong. I would say to the fellow elected officials out there, be open-minded, go big, go home. In other words, attack the very things that are preventing the individual from doing great things. And in Auburn's case, it was zoning. Zoning was handcuffing individuals, handcuffing local developers, local residents from doing what they needed to do, and handcuffing businesses as well. So by eliminating that, we've had great results, and those results are tangible. So don't be afraid of it. Go big, go home. We only get one shot at this. So if your legacy is going to be one of control, that's your legacy. But if your legacy is going to be one of supporting individuals, right, to make better their family and their communities, I personally choose that.
Okay, and now that we've probably
alienated everyone?
No, I don't think we've alienated everybody, but I think we've got a lot of people in the audience who work in the trenches of zoning and planning in their communities. And those are very big, bold statements. What was it like working through this with your frontline planning staff?
Well, you know what? My frontline planning staff, the one we currently have right now, and I'm going to say this, regardless if they're on the call or not, they might be. I think they're probably fact checking me right now, but they're great because they believe in it too. They believe that growth needs to happen. And if you don't grow, you're dying. And Auburn was a stagnant, on the verge of dying city for 40 plus years. So change has to happen for progress to happen. So they've completely embraced it. A lot of these initiatives, like form-based code, for example, wasn't my idea. Our staff was leading that effort with fair degrees of success, slowly, back 10, 15 years ago. What we're doing now is we're getting through those initial growing pains. You know, when I came on board, you just saw that we needed to accelerate it quickly. Time was on our side. It was the right environment to do so. And planning is great, but execution is critical. And that's what people are going to remember. So we had a great plan, but your plan is only as good as the execution. So now we're executing violently, if you would. Or aggressively, I guess it'd be nice to say. And staff has just they've been great. And that is really key, because as any elected official, like I said before, I'm not a subject matter expert on this. You talk to enough people, you listen to enough people on the streets in the grocery store, you understand what they're looking for, what they're needing. And you start looking and educating yourself. And that's great. You have a passion, you can have a vision, you can start articulating that vision. But unless you have staff to smooth out your rough edges and make it into a reality, make it into a zone, a policy, you're never going to get anywhere.
Salim,
I'll add to that is that the Auburn's sort of like technical approach has worked really well, which was combining a unifying overarching vision, which I really sort of associate with the mayor, with then sort of a series of piecemeal reforms, each one brought up at its own time. And those are really coming more from staff, right? Because they've got to actually draft them. And that combination has worked really well because you need the vision to drive things and to say like, hey, we're not trying to go small here. We have decided through our comprehensive planning process, through our elections, we've decided, yeah, we really want to grow. I think that's something we talk about in the case study is that these folks had to stand for election in the middle of this. The mayor's got 2-year terms, he's been reelected twice. And people knew like Jason Levesque is associated with a pro-growth, rapid change mindset, and they came back and reelected him twice. So if they had not wanted that, that's actually, I think this goes back to your 10 people who show up at the meeting. The proof is in the pudding, right? You stand before the voters, identify where you are clearly, and let them really choose in that honest democratic forum.
So
And then letting the staff bring things out one by one, it makes it just digestible. If they had tried to do it all at once, I think that it just would have overwhelmed their small city capacity.
So evolutionary rather than revolutionary. For the folks on the call who may not be planning experts, give us a quick summary of what form-based zoning is and how it's different than the baseline condition in a lot of communities.
Right. So form-based zoning notionally regulates the way things kind of look from the outside rather than what goes on inside them. Right. So the origins of zoning in the US are about separating uses and had very little to say about structure. And so form-based code came about maybe it's in the late 80s, early 90s, and people said, well, what if we said, well, we don't actually care what goes on indoors, we care about what it looks like and how it contributes to the built form. And all cards on the table, I'm pretty skeptical of form-based codes. Usually they end up combining use restrictions with building restrictions. And you've got rules on how much window glazing you need, and exactly where the building has to be put relative to the sidewalk, blah, blah, blah. Auburn's has a couple of those things that I'd love to just kind of put a pen through. But largely it's like the mayor said, it's a box, you can do what you want in the box. And I think one of the things that really is telling here, and maybe this is a good indicator species for zoning reform, is that after they made the change, they got a ton of minor remodeling requests. People wanted to replace their old garages, update their porches, and it was stuff that they couldn't do before without a variance because their house was non-conforming, right? Their lot was too small, or their existing garage was within the setbacks. They couldn't technically replace it without a variance, which maybe the city would have let them do. It's a pretty permissive department, but it was a hassle. And you get rid of the hassle, and all of a sudden people are like, oh yeah, I got $25,000 to invest in my house, which of course benefits the city in the long run through tax revenue, benefits the neighborhood through keeping things sharp looking and reinvested. So I think that's if you're a planner, you're like, is this form-based code working? Maybe look at your renovations. And if your renovation numbers are going down, it's a sign that people are finding it actually hard to even work around the existing housing stock. So yeah, I would say Auburn's form-based code is really good, but that's not true for all form-based codes. And you get some that are incredibly restrictive and nothing can get built without a variance because the people who wrote the code had one vision in mind and it doesn't actually economically make sense in the city that they're in.
Terrific.
Greg, if I could add on that, I mean, again, we're talking about one area we looked at over 3 months of our new, if you would, progressive form-based code being in place. Several hundred homes, over $750,000 in permit value just in 3 months. Everything from porch remodel to in-law apartments to new windows, new fire escapes, health and safety. These things were never invested in prior. So Salim's absolutely right. This is increasing the value. It's increasing community pride. And you're seeing this money flow through our economy with local contractors doing the work and with people actually staying in the community. We had a couple of folks that said, if we can't add on an extra bedroom for our ailing mother, we're going to have to sell our home and move to a different community. We didn't want that. And they didn't want that. So we've actually made a big impact on individuals' lives.
So one of the things I'm curious about is Maine is not exactly known as a dense urban landscape, right? With building all the way out to the horizon line. you've got something of a twin city there in Lewiston. Have you gotten any interest or feedback from that town or other communities about what you've done?
Yeah, we're just getting feedback from communities all over the country, actually. So I've had conversations with city councilors, primarily elected officials from Maryland to Connecticut, and that, and Maine, throughout Maine. And we've gotten a lot of attention, a lot of media attention, a lot of press attention, which is interesting because all that attention that we've gotten in the public eye has really driven a lot of developers to Auburn. Auburn's the 5th largest city in the state. Portland's the largest city in the state. But so far this year, we've had almost twice as many building permits pulled or permitted units than Portland has. So we're starting to see that shift into Auburn, because Auburn is known as being a business friendly, developer friendly, people friendly, and a city that's willing to actually work to tear down barriers for development and make it easier for you to do good things.
One of the things my colleague Patrick likes to say is that developers are okay with hearing no, because no means no. What they don't like hearing is, we'll see. And so to what extent, it sounds like we've got empirical evidence that we're not just building more habitable properties and more commercial properties, but we're also improving existing properties. To what extent would you say you've removed uncertainty from the system in your community?
To what extent? I would say we've removed probably 90% of the uncertainty within our community. The last 10% of the uncertainty isn't even in Auburn's control. It could be state regulations, wetland mitigation at the federal level, Army Corps of Engineers, and so forth, which is, that's common throughout Maine and the country, right? Those challenges. But we have an attitude and a culture of, yes, we want it. Let's keep going through it. If we find a challenge, let's overcome it together. Ideally, we'll find a challenge and we'll fix it and present it to you, a solution along with that challenge. That seems to be really making a big difference. And it's such a small community of developers, subcontractors, project managers, they all talk. And that word has gotten out. And I think that's really made Auburn be at the top of people's thought process when they come here.
Terrific. So, I'd like both of you to chime in on this. One of the things that struck me when I first heard the story and read the draft of the case study was that you weren't seeing a big success right out of the gate. You tried to do something with your agricultural zone, and it ultimately found a lot of pushback. But that pushback led to what you were eventually able to do. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you turned essentially your opposition into adherents or supporters of your other ideas.
Okay, so I didn't necessarily turn all the opposition into supporters of infill, but I did neutralize their argument. So, and that was a huge win in itself. Now they're like, okay, we're not going to advocate for what you're doing, but we're not going to, stand up on a soapbox and come to meetings and say what you're doing is wrong. So it did shift the narrative a bit. What we're seeing now is, though, a lot of the people in town are adamant that we shift development to the more rural or more, the folks in the privacy market, this, protected agricultural resource protection zone, which, by the way, is 40% of our city's landmass and is about the same size as the city of Portland, acreage wise, a little bit bigger, actually. And it's 80% forested, low value. So we're starting to see that shift. What I think the ultimate outcome here is everybody is fully understanding, or at least understanding in part, of the uniqueness of Auburn and the fact that we have different types of markets. We have people that are looking for the walkability market. We have people that are looking for the privacy market. And how can they all coincide? And they actually need to start happening with regards to reform simultaneously or as close to as possible. So you don't have so much pressure, development pressure in any one given neighborhood. You're actually spreading that pressure out, growing organically versus, going in and really just increasing in an unnatural way the demand on a limited supply in one geographically constrained area. So we're building consensus, we're building understanding, and I think we're building folks that have more of an open mind now because they're paying attention. They might be paying attention for the wrong reasons, but they're paying attention. And now they can add a good, thoughtful voice into the debate.
Salim, do you have a sense of what Auburn has done right in that regard that many other cities don't get right? Was there some unique element to that, or was it right place, right time, or something else?
Well, wait, I'm not positive I understand your question.
What
What Auburn's getting right in which aspect? Politics?
No, in terms of getting, I'll rephrase the question. In terms of getting this package of policy reforms over the finish line, you mentioned their incremental approach in bringing things to the council for a vote in a more atomic fashion. Are there other things that they've done that run counter to what you've seen happen elsewhere in the country? What I'm trying to get a feel for here for the audience is how unique is this, and how much versus how much of it is wholly portable to other cities?
No, that's a really good question. I haven't had, so the nature of my work is not mostly working with councils. I mostly work on the zoning side. I'd say maybe the biggest answer is this became the #1 issue in Auburn for a couple of years. And so council time is a finite commodity. And so maybe that's kind of the virtue of being a smaller city, is that you can focus. There aren't 100 different things going on at once. There's 3 or 4. And so you can pick one of those and really get after it. And the short council terms also meant that people were choosing to run, and the mayor was encouraging them to run for vacant seats who wanted to work on this. He said, this is going to be what we're working on. Come on and join me on the council. Let's have people who have served on the planning board run for council, and then bring that knowledge base with them. So I think that just the focus really helps. And that's not something that every city can do, right? You can't make everything your #1 priority. And I think that's maybe just a decision point, as you say, okay, do we have the political will right now to say housing is our #1 problem? We're going to put our assets into this and have council meeting after council meeting getting into our ADU ordinance, our parking ordinance, our height ordinance, right? So I think that's probably the biggest thing. It's hard to say if there's a lot of things that other places are doing wrong, as much as maybe the right time, right place, and focus.
And Greg, if I could add to that, I think
Please.
Housing wasn't just chosen, I think, to be our #1 priority. It is the #1 priority. It's the priority when solved, changes everything else. I have yet to meet an issue within my city that if you don't drill down to it, it has to do with housing. From generational poverty to drugs, to homelessness, to economic growth and development, to, you name it, the status of our roads. It all comes down to housing, and that choke point is zoning. And when we eliminate that choke point, we can grow, and that solves literally, in my opinion, every single issue that's facing our city right now.
So how, I have a 2-part question to follow up, Jason. So first of all, just as a technical matter, is there any element of inclusionary zoning in Auburn's current zoning practices at all?
An element of inclusionary? Everything we're getting rid of exclusionary zoning. So everything we're doing is inclusionary by nature. ADUs, small houses, multi-unit, single family, so forth, all mixed up in zoning. No exclusivity, if you would. Back to the old original premise of zoning, which is separating by use.
So let me be specific, and Salim, step on me here if I'm misdefining inclusionary zoning. Typically, inclusionary zoning manifests in the form of a developer approaches the city for a project, and the city says, yes, you may develop it, but you must also develop these lower market rate things over here.
No. Horrible. Worst thing anyone could ever do.
Tell us how you
challenge
feel.
Anyone to say I'm wrong. The market will start fixing itself. We have to get out of the way. and you're putting requirements on developers, it's not your money, it's their money. So why would we?
Okay. All right. So that I'm going to
So
take.
here's the other piece here. So Auburn has, for its size, a really large public housing stock,
Oh.
several old buildings. Actually, one of the most beautiful residential buildings in Auburn is a large, low-income senior building that was originally built as one of those gorgeous late 19th century mills, Barker Arms, and so there is a much bigger kind of baseline housing stock aimed specifically at low-income residents than most other cities have. And there's a really large stock of just like old housing that is actually quite cheap. Auburn's problem was much more so like no market rate apartments had been built in the city for a generation. And one of the issues that the city had is they're actually trying to sell city-owned land and say like, hey, come in, we really want somebody to do a like first floor restaurant, upper stories, single one-bedroom apartments right in our core walkable downtown. And the Portland developers were like, hey, we know what we can do in Portland. It's hard to develop here, but the rents are really high. So we know the math. You're 40 minutes up the road. If we build this, will anybody come? And the city staff had to kind of do a lot of hand-holding, connect the developers to local employers, because the gap in Auburn's market wasn't the low income level. It was, is there actually a market for market rate, new housing in the city? And it turns out the answer is a resounding yes. How that interacted with COVID, I think I'm actually, as a researcher, really curious about. Maybe people who work in Portland are like, I wouldn't make this commute 5 days a week, but 3 days a week I'll do it. And that hybrid work environment is going to benefit places like Auburn that are a little bit further from the biggest job centers.
So that touches on a question.
Yeah, it was a really good question from the audience member.
Yeah, it touches on another part of that question, which was how do residents react, or how have residents reacted to this more open style of growth? Are they certainly you'll never have a community that's 100% happy or 100% angry, but what would you say the majority of people are doing? And to the extent there's been pushback, what's it looked like?
You know what? That's a question I'm constantly searching for an answer. At one point we had, right now about 9% of our housing stock is quote unquote subsidized or inclusive. Okay. So most communities shoot for 10%. So we're right there. We needed that growth in multiple different styles of market rate, attainable housing, specifically for those making 80 to 120% of the low to moderate income range, middle-class folks, working people. And the market can keep our values lower than, let's say, Portland. So it produces some challenges, but also some benefits. People, it's hard. You're always going to get that small percentage, that 5 to 10% that are adamantly against anything. And primarily, those individuals already have everything they need, everything they want, everything they believe they ever wanted. So, and they're afraid that by letting someone else have something, they have to give something away. They have to lose something. So we've had a lot of people say, we want that growth. We want more people. We want that. We just don't want it in our backyard, because that proximity is what they're afraid they're going to give up in their own lives, and they don't want to. And I can understand it. I mean, they work really hard to get where they're at. They want to maintain, they want to preserve. Part of our education process saying you can preserve. In actuality, you're going to have a better community, a higher value in your primary investment. But that's a struggle. It really is a struggle. So we're always going to get that group that just say no. And we're also going to get a group that's very concerned, because they're hearing a lot of things from the group that's always going to say no. And a lot of it probably isn't true. And I think any elected official has a story about that as well, where that mouse turns into a lion relatively quickly. It's like the old game of telephone.
So let me circle back to something you mentioned earlier, because
Greg, can I jump on this last question actually, because
oh, please.
That was one of the things that I really enjoyed doing in the case study with Eric. Is we used his access obviously to the planning department's records to look at how engagement went as this kind of big ambitious upzoning went through. And so if you go to the case study, this diagram with a pyramid that we came up with, The base of the pyramid is the whole population. We don't know what they think. We can't get in the heads of everyone who lives in Auburn. Then the next tier is voters. It's a pretty large share of the adult population. The voters keep sending Jason and pro-growth council members back. So that looks pretty affirmative. The next tier up is people who call the planning department. It's actually hundreds of those who get notices saying your zoning is going to be changed, or the zoning within X number of feet of you is going to be changed. And they call up and they're like, what does this mean? I'm pretty confused. And so this is actually an underrated aspect of staff work, is just walking people through. And, you know, the way that Eric described it, most people would call either confused or a little bit frightened, maybe angry. What's happening to my land? I don't understand this, but I don't want, I liked it the way it was. I know that I liked where I lived, and you're changing it. By the time staff got finished explaining, 2/3 were happy or neutral, and just like, oh, okay, fine, this doesn't actually change anything for me. A small number were immediately like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna, build a second unit or whatever. And then obviously there were all the people who realized they could do a renovation without a variance now. So a lot of people went away happy. About 1/3 still were unhappy with the change when they left. So again, that's, if you've got like 2/3 who are like, yeah, I like it, sounds good. That's pretty good. But then there's this really small minority at the top who shows up to the meetings and yells. And it's often the same people. The city's done a ton of meetings, as any city would, going through something like this. And one of the universal complaints of the naysayers is you're not listening to us. And as anyone with small children knows, like, you're not listening to me can mean you're not hearing me, or it can mean you're not doing what I say. And by the way, that goes both ways, parents to children and children to parents. We all use this language. And there's that nice ambiguity where it's like, yes, it is the job of a mayor to listen, but does listen mean that you have to do what the person who's speaking says? Well, no, not quite. But I think it's a challenge. One of the ongoing things is that there's Auburn has a petition process that can be used against any council action. So people successfully brought a petition to get enough signatures that forced a reconsideration of the issue. And a change that the city made, or is in the process of making, is to cut down on the amount of commercial activity that can go on in the new zone. So it makes it a little bit less form-based, right? So form-based code would say we really don't care what's happening behind those walls, and the neighbors, I think, reasonably said, hey, lots of commercial activities aren't just behind your walls, they involve customers coming up and down the street. And I think the city smartly said, hey, that's something we can compromise on. We're keeping all of the housing deregulation and permissiveness. But a residential neighborhood, and where I live in Maryland, it's a street that's packed with high-rise buildings, and there's just very little traffic. The truth is, even a lot of residences just don't generate much traffic. But a commercial district can generate quite a bit of traffic, and reasonably, I think the city's compromising down on that to be able to save the more core parts of the reform.
So this is a question for both of you from the audience. Can you talk more about the second unit ordinance, and in particular, how do you see homeowners using the option, and are they still facing barriers to building these additional units?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So our secondary dwelling unit, or our ordinance is very, very loose. Basically, it says if you have the land and you can be within your setbacks, anywhere in the city, you can build a second unit, either attached or detached. Great. And what we've seen, we didn't put a size cap, minimum, maximum, anything like that. And what we've seen is a mix, interesting mix. We've seen a retired fireman, for example, build a secondary dwelling unit that was twice as large as his primary dwelling unit, because him and his wife are at a stage of life where they wanted a big home, and they sold their smaller primary home to their kids. And we're like, we didn't expect that, but it happened. And we're like, they're happy, we're happy, flows well. So we're seeing a lot of different things happen with regards to our secondary dwelling units. I think the big takeaway is be less prescriptive, be more open. Okay, make sure it fits within that form. It's not encroaching on anything, on any other neighbor, just like any other home, and see what happens. And I think everybody is going to be surprised based upon what happens to their own unique cities or neighborhoods.
Terrific. We had another question regarding the specifics of how the city, or even whether the city, it wasn't clear, facilitated these discussions between developers and large employers in the community.
So developers and large employers. So I would say we acted as kind of the intermediary between large employers and developers. If we're talking about residential developers, we hear it all the time. We need workforce. We need workforce. This is what we're paying. Here are the demographics. This is what we need, from hospitals to light industrial and everything in between, not just in Auburn, but also in a regional sense as well, working with some of our other municipal partners, as well as our COGs. And we then take that information, we package that, and we get that out to the developers in order so they understand what their target market is. So we acted as an intermediary. Sometimes, probably more often than we actually realize, developers are talking to larger employers or mid-sized employers and working out those specifics behind the scenes, and that's great. We're just not aware of those conversations.
Are there any parking requirements for the secondary units that are being built?
No.
I like it. Simple.
And let me add to that. So, so this is a really interesting thing about ADUs. The book about ADUs was written by somebody from Portland, Oregon, where it's wet and cold. And he says you can never use a garage conversion for an ADU because there's always mold in the garages. And I'm sure that's true in Auburn, Maine. But in the Southwest, where it's dry and hot, garages usually last just fine. And so you can actually do the garages will pass code for the quality of a 15 or 20-year-old garage will be fine for residential use. And so it's really important to get rid of parking restrictions for secondary dwellings, because the number one source of housing, at least in the drier parts of the country, are old garages, which the structure's there. And so you're kind of getting, the new dwelling at something like half of the, per square foot cost. If you have to build from scratch, there really isn't any cost benefit to building an ADU. They cost just as much as any other residential construction. So you've got to find creative ways to reuse. So stripping out parking requirements is probably your number one way to get those granny flats built. Los Angeles has had the biggest success with this because, again, dry, warm climate. They've had, probably since the invention of the car in the garage, they've had people living illegally in garages, garage conversions. And once they legalized it, people were like, oh, we can actually do this right, get it permitted, make it safer. And I think that's a great approach to doing ADUs.
And by the way, Mainers, we're tough. Most of us don't have garages. We just shovel off the car after a blizzard. We're fine. But the market will take care of that. If someone wants to have an ADU for rent in the open market, if they don't have parking for that individual, they might not be able to demand as much of a rate. But if they do have additional parking for that individual, then they probably can get more. So why should government dictate the effectiveness of your model? That's up to the individual homeowner and developer.
So, two-parter question to wrap this up. Mayor Levesque, what's next for Auburn? And Salim, you can think about your question at the same time. What do you think is the next big frontier for housing reform in America's cities?
Isn't this like the game password? Can I just pass?
No,
It comes back.
no, you cannot, sir.
What's next for Auburn? Really what I see is a continuation over the next 6 to 9 months of zoning reform, a loosening up of exclusionary zoning throughout the city. But I think the result is really what's important. I think you're going to see Auburn grow from 26,000 people to about 35,000 people, which will make Auburn the second largest city in the state. And it's pretty lofty goals, going from 5 to 2, but I think that's going to happen by 2030 for a number of different reasons, primarily our acceptance of new residents and new homes.
And what's next at this nationally? I think that it's minimum lot size reform. A lot of housing reform up to this point has been focused on duplexes or accessory dwelling units, which are great, but don't deliver a large number of units in a short amount of time. Those are evolutionary, like that's your 50-year plan for allowing an area to change. But if you're especially looking at greenfield growth, right? So you're a Texas suburb, or you're a Montana city that's got this influx of Californians. You got residents who want to own their own homes. You want them to own their own homes. You want them to build wealth, contribute to the city, stay long term. They can't do that if they're buying $100,000 worth of land, right? That's going to put it out of the price range, or if it's California, $500,000 worth of land, right? That's going to put it out of most people's price range, and that sort of that happy place where you're going to get most people able to afford the house if the overall market in the area is reasonable, and you're going to get bipartisan support and not make neighbors feel like, you're changing the city. This isn't what I bought into. I think small minimum lot sizes, which allows you to build a starter home or a tall townhouse on 1,000 to 5,000 square feet of land, depending on where you are in the country. Small has a different meaning. And those kinds of lots, I think that's the future. And I think we're going to see more cities and more states saying like, hey, we got to get rid of this requirement that every house sits on an acre or a quarter acre, and let's economize on our infrastructure. Let's make our neighborhoods dense enough that kids can walk to school, and let's make it so that homeownership is within reach of most people who have a job in our area.
Thanks. The great answers, both of you. I am trying to keep everybody on a time limit, and so I'd like to thank everybody, both our audience with its interesting questions, and Mayor Levesque's and Salim's time. As I said at the start of this call, we are here to help with thorny solutions like this. I'm going to go ahead and probably stretch a bit and say that both Salim and Mayor Levesque would be happy to speak with anybody who's on the call today in the audience about these or related issues. And if we can be helpful in your community, we'd like to. We have recorded this webinar, and we'll make the recording available to you by tomorrow, so you can share it with friends and colleagues if you'd like. And as always, thanks for being part of our work here at BCP. Take care, all.